Hey Raven, I saw you asked about cave stories and I thought that I finally had a story I could share. I liked to go caving and prefer to go to new ones to change things up. Unless a cave has different paths to take and places to explore, I tend to get bored. However, I don't live near any actual caves, and the first ones I experienced were the caves in Missouri with my girlfriend at the time. They were great, and I really enjoyed them, but it made me want to see more. I wanted to walk through caves on my own, experience it, and take as much time as I wanted. This opened a new door for us, as well as future adventures. My girlfriend, Kaylee, and I started taking annual trips around our anniversary to different caves. One year we looked into some caves in Utah, and after seeing some great things about them online, we planned our annual trip to go check them out. The first one we went to wasn't too big. We were able to get through it in one day with little variation to the paths available. We saved a bigger cave for one of our last days. I had read online that this cave was pretty expansive and had plenty of different paths to check out. It should also be noted that this was not a cave that had any sort of touring path or ride in it. This was all for individual exploration. It wasn't illegal or anything, as in there were no trespassing signs, but there were signs stressing caution due to the many risks of exploring an unmonitored cave. However, this wouldn't be the first time for us, so it certainly didn't deter us. We went in with our normal gear, such as headlamps, an extra flashlight, ropes and climbing gear, a first aid kit, a multi-tool, and plenty of other things that we always brought with us. It started out as normal, walking a narrow path, climbing over some boulders and jumping deeper into crevices. Then we came across a very small hole in the wall. Some of those break off and lead into other parts of the cave that may never have been explored before. Sometimes they are created by another person, someone who is a lot more professional than us. Sometimes folks have a cave surveyor map it out themselves, and they try to make their own paths to parts of the caves they couldn't get to. I've never done it myself, but I've seen others do it, which was pretty cool. Either way, I knew I needed to check it out. The only issue was, when I say crevice, I mean it. We would be crawling on our stomachs through a very small tunnel. And because we didn't know if this would lead anywhere, there was no point in both of us going, so I told Kaylee I would go first to see what I could find. Since it was a new cave, I told her that if I wasn't back in half an hour, and I wasn't responding, to get help, and she agreed. When we separated like that, we had similar agreements. We can never be too careful. We've never had to follow through on one of those agreements, thankfully, but this time it really challenged us. Kaylee told me to be careful, and I climbed in the tunnel with nothing but my headlamp. I wouldn't fit with my backpack, and I wouldn't be able to reach back and get anything anyways. I started crawling through, and the further along I went, the darker it got. If you're claustrophobic, this may get pretty difficult for you, so just a warning. As well as the tunnel getting darker, it also got smaller. It got to the point where I had to completely exhale and wiggle a few inches forward before pausing to breathe and starting again. I've done something similar before, but I at least had people with me and had an idea of where the ending was. In this one, I was going in blind. The crawling was pretty exhausting, and because of how small it was, it started to get warmer too. At one point, I stopped just to take a break. I shouted back to Kaylee to say I was alright, but I didn't get a response. I assumed I was further in than I thought I was. I finally picked up my speed some when the path seemed to open up a few inches as it curved. Finally, the tunnel opened up to a wider hole, and shining around my headlamp, I could tell there was a small cavern. It was at least big enough for me to crawl. That was one of the best stretches ever. However, the happiness was quickly shot down. First, my headlamp had flickered a few times, indicating it was running low. I didn't grab the spare battery in my backpack, thinking I wouldn't need it. Stupid me should keep it in my pocket regardless. There wasn't much to the cavern, so I decided to go back anyways. At least I had checked it out, so I knew that we weren't missing anything. I started turning around to go back in the tunnel when I felt something drip on my face. It was water. I turned off my lamp and looked up to see if I could see light coming through. I couldn't really see one, but we were still above ground level, so it was entirely possible that it was raining and was now seeping down into the cave. This wasn't good. Sometimes it could just be a small stream, but in the worst case scenario, the place could fill. I needed to get out of there quickly because I didn't want to find out which one it would be. I jumped back in the tunnel, but this time I put one arm in front of me so I could turn my headlamp on and off to preserve the light. As I started crawling through and hit the tight spot again, it seemed to go on a lot longer than I remembered. I told myself it was just because I was tired and worked myself up with the water, and after a few breaths, I continued on. I would flick my light on briefly to see the long dark tunnel ahead and keep wiggling. I stopped again, feeling this sense of dread. I needed to calm down because otherwise this was going to get very difficult. My oxygen alone could become an issue. I again stopped and tried to get a grip. I didn't have issues like this normally, so I didn't understand why it was happening to me now. Stopping only made things worse for me. The silence in that tunnel was deafening. There was nothing, no wind, no ambient noise that we were all used to in these caves. I only heard the small pebbles falling off the bottom of my boots. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, and I could feel my heart beating in my temples. Stopping would not help me calm down, it just made everything worse. I found myself crawling faster in a panic, wanting to get out. I called out for Kaylee, but still had no response. I just pushed forward until I slammed my hand into something hard. I clicked on my lamp. It was a dead end. How could I have hit a dead end? This was the same tunnel I took, the only tunnel. The only thing I could do was scoot backwards and look around to make sure that I didn't miss a turn. That's when I remembered there was a curve. Did I take a curve? I couldn't remember. I told myself that had to be what happened, and kept my lamp on to make sure I didn't miss anything. Thankfully, I did see a small pocket that curved to the right, and after backing up enough, I lifted myself up over the slight lip and kept going. I was starting to not think my moves through. I was just going, which was reckless. But I couldn't think straight. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. I felt like I had to have been in there for a good hour by now. This was taking a lot longer, and surely Kaylee had already run off to find help, and hopefully I would see a light soon and someone would help me on to the other end. And that's when I saw it. I had turned my light back off and I could see a faint light in the tunnel. It had to be the exit. I continued on and yelled for Kaylee when I saw what looked like a dark shadow walking by as the light disappeared and came back. I called out for Kaylee again, but no response. I was confused and upset. If I could see the light in her shadow, there's no way she didn't hear me, right? I just kept crawling until finally I reached the exit, but as I fell out, Kaylee was nowhere around. And worse yet, that wasn't where I had entered. I was in a completely different part of the cave. I stood up, took a deep breath, and stretched. Being back on my feet really made a difference. I hollered again for Kaylee, but still did not get a response. I continued walking when I started hearing the sound of rushing water. A little further into my walk, I found another tunnel, much like the one that I was in that had water flowing right through it, acting like a drain pipe. My stomach dropped, thinking that it was quite possible that the tunnel I was in was now filled with water too. I had to walk up a slight incline when I heard someone clear their throat. "Kaylee?" I once again called out. I heard shuffling like someone running, and soon enough, I saw Kaylee come around the curve, smiling but looking confused. She asked where I had come from, and I explained the tunnel. I apologized for being gone for so long, but then asked why she seemed so calm, and why she hadn't gone for help. She again looked puzzled. "You've only been gone for like 20 minutes. How the hell was that possible? It felt like I had been in there for at least an hour or two. But then there was the shadow that I had seen. I asked her if she heard me shouting or why she had been deeper into the cave, but again she declined. She looked concerned, and explained that she hadn't moved from where I entered. She hadn't even considered me coming out from another tunnel. But if it wasn't her, then what was that shadow that I saw? She said no one else had gone far into that cave. There was an older couple that entered and talked to her for a moment, but didn't want to go any further when they noticed it had started to rain. She assumed at that point that it had only been about 10 minutes, and that I was going to either turn around or just go back because of the rain. But again, if she didn't move and no one else had gone that deep into the cave, whose shadow did I see? I told her my whole experience in those tunnels. I told her how I found the small cavern pocket. I explained the water I started to feel. I explained how I somehow got lost in the shadow that I had seen. She seemed visibly worried about me, and thought that maybe being in there, in the dark and silence, that maybe I was experiencing some sort of sensory deprivation. We didn't stay in the cave after that. It can get dangerous when it rains anyways, so we left. I later learned that cave syndrome is absolutely a thing too. It's entirely possible that it was all in my head due to me being in those tunnels for so long, but I honestly don't know which is worse. Knowing that I was practically going crazy when nothing was wrong whatsoever, or that maybe I wasn't so alone in the tunnels, and there really was another unidentified person or thing in there with us that we didn't know about. Since I was a kid, I always enjoyed going on road trips with my family. That love only grew as I got older, and I wanted to go everywhere that I could. However, you kind of start running out of money if you're not working, so I had this brilliant idea to try trucking. I started out just doing ride-alongs. I was just the entertainer, basically, while a more seasoned trucker would drive. I would occasionally drive, but it was more on the open and flat roads when there wasn't harsh weather. It was a blast. I enjoyed every minute of it, so I did everything I had to until I had a truck of my own. I worked for an independent contractor, so I would be hauling supplies for a lot of different companies. But the truck was mine, and I made it look everything like me. It was a royal purple. I even went a little extra on the inside. I was practically going to be living in it, so I might as well make it look like the world's smallest studio apartment, right? Now, I know I haven't been a trucker nearly as long as some of my coworkers, but I have still loved every minute of it. Okay, well, most of it. Sometimes there are those unavoidable situations that I could live without, but for the most part, it was a dream job for me. Now, there were a few times that I didn't love it as much, but I can't even include them in the unavoidable parts. These were more so just bizarre or weird, so instead of complaining about them, I decided I would share them with the world. This first one happened to me back in 2019. It was a hot and beautiful July driving across New Mexico. Also, one of my favorite states to drive through. I had my windows down, was enjoying the warm air and probably singing along to something. It was around 5 or 6 p.m. I remember this because I was debating on stopping for food when I first noticed it. A truck in my side mirror. It looked dark in color, but it was pretty far behind me. I could also tell that it was gaining on me. As it got closer, something about it kept catching my eye. I didn't realize it until it was right behind me. It looked a lot like mine. It was purple and it had the silver pinstriping down the center. I thought, huh, what a coincidence. Then the truck passed me and I could see the box trailer that it was hauling. It was funny at the time, because the logo on it was like the opposite of mine. I don't want to mention the actual partner I work with, but basically, I was hauling stuff for something like Waterworks Unlimited, whereas they were hauling for Desert Dynamics. Again, I thought it was amusing and left it at that. It passed me and it slowly faded in the distance. Later on, I had finally decided to make a stop for food. When I got back on the road again at the intersection to get on the highway, I once again saw what I assumed to be the same truck that I had seen earlier. Looking at it more, it was bizarre to see just how much it was the same as my truck. It was the same royal purple and silver. It was even a Kenworth like mine. And while I did get the custom paint job, anyone could have chosen those colors. But what are the odds that it would look the exact same? Be the same model, and even have the same sticker in the window that I had? The sticker is a Moogle riding on a chocobo. If you've ever played Final Fantasy, you know what those are. It's so very specific that it blew me away to see it. I couldn't believe it. Their windows were pretty dark though, so I couldn't see the driver, unfortunately. I was hoping they would have noticed too, and maybe we would have had a little moment, but my light turned green before then. I just held on to the moment and continued with my drive, excited to share this story with my friends. Alas, I would have one more run-in with this truck. This time, it was in Arizona. I had stayed at a truck stop overnight and got up to use the restroom and freshen up before I headed out again. But as I opened my door and stepped out, I saw that purple truck, parked a few spaces over from mine. This time, I had nothing stopping me. I walked right over to the truck to see it up close. I was shocked. It was the exact same as mine. The Kenworth W900, purple with silver, the Final Fantasy sticker in the window, and it also had a small rust spot on the bottom of the passenger side door, just like mine. Seriously, what are the odds of that? I had to get a picture of it to compare and show as proof, but as I was snapping one, the door to the cabin opened up. A small woman steps out, with short brown hair and green eyes, wearing a black ghost face hoodie. Guess who else is a small, short, brown-haired girl with green eyes, wearing a ghost-faced hoodie? I cannot make this up. I knew what she had to be thinking because I was thinking the same thing. I just didn't know what to say out loud until she did. She said that I had a nice truck, and I started laughing. Thankfully, she found the humor in it too and confirmed that she was indeed the same truck I saw the other 2 times. We talked about where we were heading and all of our similarities, and even shared a few photos. She said it was also a custom paint job that her husband had surprised her with. I was missing the husband in that equation. I got a loan to get my truck all customized and fixed up. But other than looking identical, and our trucks matching to a T, the rest of us that we discussed were actually the exact opposite. She was married with 2 kids. I was single. I lived in Texas. She was from North Dakota on a long haul, and she hated the heat. There were some other similarities and stark differences, but it was just so crazy to experience. It was like it was me from some sort of parallel universe. I wanted to add her on Facebook or something just to keep in touch, but she didn't offer, and neither did I. I don't know if she felt the same way, but part of me thought that maybe we weren't supposed to run into each other. Maybe if I did become friends with her, it could mess things up. So I just took this as one of those crazy experiences that I'm glad that I could witness, and we went on our ways. I wouldn't mind running into her again, though. My second experience that I wanted to tell you about was still strange, but also a bit more creepy. This time it was last year, around November. I was heading to Oregon and it was already pretty chilly, and being used to warm weather, I was pretty bundled up. While driving along, I looked over and noticed that my passenger side mirror was off. I'm very particular with my mirrors, and it drives me crazy when they get moved. It was going to bother me until I fixed it. I had already been driving for a few hours, and I thought that I could stop for a quick break, stretch some, and fix my mirrors, and also have a snack while I'm at it. The road I was on had some decent traffic passing by, and it had a good-sized shoulder, so I decided to pull over. Once stopped, I grabbed one of my meal bars and got out of my truck to walk around a bit. My driver's side mirror looked fine, so I walked around the back of my truck and to my passenger side. Now, the problem with adjusting those mirrors, and why it's such a big deal to me, is because it's not as simple as adjusting the mirrors on your little sedan. You have to adjust it some, get in and check, adjust some more, ad nauseum. I can practically zone out at this point trying to adjust it. But then, as I was fiddling with the mirror and picking at something I spotted on my truck, I heard the familiar sound of tires slowly creeping upon gravel. I looked over just enough to see a small black car stop in front of my truck. I thought it was a cop at first, but once I did a double take, it was obvious that it wasn't. My second guess was that it was just your average guy wanting to help. I got that quite often as a woman. The fact that he didn't stop to do something in his car and approached me first told me this too. I watched my peripheral as he approached my truck. He stopped by my front passenger side, and I waited for him to say something, but he never did. I finished tweaking my mirror and got in to check it once more. It looked right, so then my attention was turned to this guy that was now walking closer to my truck door. I was hoping he wouldn't, but part of me was wondering if he was going to step on the side to look in or even open my door. But to my surprise, he didn't. I watched him walk down the side of my truck, just looking at it like he was inspecting it. He didn't touch anything, he just looked at it. But watching him then was when I realized what he was wearing. He was in denim shorts and a Hawaiian shirt that was clearly unbuttoned as it was waving in the wind. As I mentioned, it was November in Oregon, and this guy was dressed like he was sitting on the beach in July. I know everyone can handle temperatures different, but that was the first time I'd seen something that extreme, so it definitely had me raising an eyebrow. I watched him walk towards the back of my truck and out of my sight. I got a little suspicious at that point because I didn't know what he was doing back there, so I got out of my truck again and casually walked to the back to see him once more, just standing there and staring at it. I asked him if there was something that I could help him with, and he didn't even look over at me. I started to become a bit more paranoid at that point. I had heard stories about truckers being robbed, and since he was just staring at the back doors, I was concerned on if he was going to try something. He had a normal-sized car though, so it's not exactly like he had the room to take what I was hauling. I again asked him if he needed something, otherwise I needed to go, trying to sound a bit more firm in my statement. He then looked over at me and just gave the largest fake-looking smile I had ever seen. I gave him quite the look back, like a "what the hell are you doing" type look. I told him that I was going to leave and started walking back to my door. I was only a few steps away from it when he finally spoke. "Bye, Rachel." That stopped me dead in my tracks because, yeah, my name is Rachel. Good guess? Or how the hell did he know my name? There was nothing on my truck or the hoodie that I was wearing that had my name on it. I stared at him for several seconds as he went back to smiling. I asked him what he said, knowing very well what he said, but he didn't respond. I wanted to ask him how he knew my name, but something felt off. Maybe this was a setup and a distraction that I was about to fall into. I wasn't willing to take the chances, so I jumped in, quickly checked the back, and then locked the doors. At this time, the man had walked to the driver's side, still standing towards the back, and continuing to smile at me. As I drove away, I watched him in my mirror, continuing to stand in the same place, never moving, never waving. He just stood there and watched me drive away, smiling the entire time. I don't know what the hell that was all about. I never ran into him again, and I never heard anything about anyone else having a similar experience. And while I keep thinking that maybe he was just messing around with someone on the shoulder, I can't get past the fact that he knew my name. So, I guess I'll never know what his true motive was, but I'm glad it wasn't anything beyond his creepy smile and questionable winter wardrobe. So after listening to some older and similar stories, I thought mine might fit along here. First off, all names are made up for reasons that will be obvious. This is a story about something that happened to me when I was 14. This is a story about how I could have died in a fire alone and nearly went to jail for it. My family, which consisted of my parents, myself, and my 2 siblings, lived in a pretty nice little neighborhood. This was back in the 90s, so it was a time where kids were always outside playing in the yard, in the streets, with all the neighborhood kids, and no one feared for our safety. As my parents described it, the saying, "it takes a village," shined through here. If one of us started fighting with another kid, our parents knew quickly, as someone would call the other parents. But fights rarely happened. Unless Josh was there. Yes, I will call you out, Josh. Anyways, I remember having a lot of great memories there. I may not have been the perfect kid, being a bit of a nuisance at times, but I never did anything worse than what a normal young boy would do. Our next-door neighbor, Mr. Martin, was especially nice to us kids. He would always crack jokes and tease us when we were in the throes of some games. He would also toss out juice boxes for us. He didn't have any kids, and I don't recall any kids ever visiting him, so I think he got the juice boxes strictly for us. But he was never weird about it, before anyone thinks that. He treated all of us kids the same, and honestly, it was like having a grandpa next door. Sometimes he would ask us kids, when our parents were around, if we would pick up his mail for him while he was out of town. He had an adult daughter that he said he would visit on a regular basis. He just asked us to collect his mail and put it in this latching container in his backyard. I never questioned it, because that's all we had to do, and he would give whoever did it like $5. At the time, that was a lot of money for a kid my age. But being one of the older kids in the neighborhood, he asked me if I would be willing to house sit over the summer for him, as he was planning on being gone for about 2 weeks. I went and told my parents, and they came outside to talk to Mr. Martin about the logistics of it. From what I remember, and after confirming the details with my parents, Mr. Martin was going to be staying with his daughter for that time because she was about to have a baby. He was going to stay there with her to help her out when she came home from the hospital and spend some time with his new grandson. He asked me to collect his mail. This time I could just put it on the kitchen table. He asked me to run the water every once in a while and just basically make sure that everything was looking okay in the house. He even told us that I was free to help myself to any drinks or snacks that I wanted, as long as I cleaned up after myself, and that I was welcome to watch any TV or movies that I wanted. The more and more he talked about it, the more excited I was to do it. I was going to feel like an adult, being in his place by myself. And to add to it, he offered me $50. My mom tried to talk him down, but he insisted. It was good pay for an important job, and that I would deserve it. So, it was settled. I was going to be house-sitting for a few weeks, and I was going to get paid to watch TV and collect his mail. The first couple of days went smoothly. I'd stop by after school, get his mail, and then drink a soda as I walked around his home. Prior to this event, I had only been inside his living room, so I didn't know what the rest of his house looked like. It was nice, though. He had what I assumed was his bedroom, the bathroom, and another room that looked like an office. There was a small table with a computer monitor on it, a chair at the table, and a small filing cabinet, along with papers strewn about. All the doors were closed, and so I kept it that way too. Overall, it was a pretty simple and, dare I say, boring task. But it livened up by the third day. I decided I would sit over at Mr. Martin's place while I did my homework. I wanted to watch TV and not have to fight with my siblings over the remote, so it was a good excuse to be there. While I was sitting on the couch, I thought that I heard someone walking in the house. It was that distinct sound of feet dragging across the floor. It immediately put me on alert. Even though I was 14, I felt responsible for protecting this man's home. I was supposed to be watching it, right? So I went to the kitchen, grabbed the largest knife that I could find, and slowly walked down the hall. I opened each door, slowly, and I didn't see anyone. Nothing looked out of place or disturbed. So I went back to the living room and told myself that I was just hearing things, and moved on. I was alone in someone else's home, so of course there were still some nerves there. You don't know the spots in the floor that creak or the windows that whistle when they weren't closed right. There wasn't anyone in the house, and I just had to assure myself of that. I actually got caught up in whatever show I was watching and dozed off. It wasn't uncommon for me. I quite enjoyed a quick nap after school, before dinner, and to be honest, being there alone and without any distractions, it was pretty easy. But while I was in that in-between state, I started having trouble breathing. I think maybe I was dreaming because I remember waking up annoyed, feeling like one of my siblings was sitting on me, causing me to not be able to breathe. And that's when I woke up and all I saw was smoke. The hall, where I left the light on, was now filled with thick, dark smoke. I immediately jumped up, wanting to figure out what was happening. I started walking down the hallway. I opened the bathroom door, nothing there. I tried to open the office door and the doorknob was extremely hot. I started to panic. I was worried that I did something wrong that caused this, and now I had to fix it. I ran to get the biggest cup or something to fill with water and a towel to open the door. I now know that that's not the best thing to do, but I didn't know it at the time. There was a gush of hot air on my face, making me drop the water and towel and grab my face. When I finally focused again, I noticed most of the room was in flames. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I finally heard the smoke alarm going off in the kitchen, I snapped out of my stupor. In tears, I ran out the front door and barged into my house, yelling at my parents about the fire. My dad told my mom to call 911 and then ran out the door. I followed him back. He told me to stay outside while he went in. From the outside, I could see the flames through the office window. I watched as my dad ran from the kitchen and back down the hallway, where I could no longer see him. I remember standing there terrified that maybe I had done something, and terrified for my dad's safety. Shortly after, I could hear the sirens and the firemen talking to my mom, asking if I was alright and if I knew if anyone was inside. They then told me to stay back as they went in. I stood there next to my mom and siblings and did the only thing I could do. Wait. Shortly after, my dad walked out unscathed and the firemen were still in there. Then the flames became more and more dull until it was just a lot of smoke. That's when the big tears came out. I felt like such a failure. I was supposed to be watching his house and somehow it caught fire? Some people came and talked to me and my parents, and then after what seemed to be hours, I was allowed to go home and go to bed. My parents tried to tell me that everything was alright, and that they would let Mr. Martin know what happened. But it wasn't that simple. The next day, my parents told me we had to go talk to the police, and we all went together. My siblings stayed with my grandparents. I hope that I never have to step foot into a police station again. At first, it wasn't like the movies. The lobby and waiting area looked warm and inviting. The lady at the front was even nice and offered us all drinks. But then, when they took us to the room in the back, I quickly realized why I was there. They told my parents that the fire looked to be intentionally set, and guess who their prime suspect was? My parents were adamant that I would never do anything like that, and my dad was beyond pissed at the time. I was in tears, all over trying to plead that I was innocent. They threatened my parents that I would end up being charged with arson and potentially tried as an adult. I didn't know what I was going to do. And to make matters worse, Mr. Martin returned the day after the fire and he would not back me up either. There was even something in the local news where Mr. Martin said that he was disappointed in me and that I seemed troubled. I heard my parents talking about it. I was angry and upset. I felt betrayed and even set up. If the fire was intentional, who had done it? Because it wasn't me, and yet I was taking the fall for it. It didn't take long before we saw trucks at Mr. Martin's house, and he eventually moved and we never saw him again. I was never charged because they didn't have proof that I did it, but the damage was already done. My parents and close friends believed me, thank God, but that didn't mean that everyone did. Some people in the neighborhood started looking at me differently, and it was obvious. We did what we could to move on, our true friends staying by our side. I just had things that I had to deal with on my own. I didn't like being alone anymore, smelling smoke or hearing smoke alarms go off, as it would set me off, and I would have panic attacks. But as I got older, I got better. Then, nearly a decade later as an adult, I went to visit my parents one night after dinner and we talked about our old neighborhood. That was when my mom went, "Oh, did you hear about Mr. Martin?" I hadn't. I had moved out of town and had all but forgotten about him. He had actually been arrested and charged with insurance fraud. Apparently, after 3 house fires, a car wreck, and a work-related incident, they finally thought that it was suspicious and started investigating. He admitted to setting the fires, including the one that I was at. He was found guilty and went to prison. I was shocked. Mr. Martin was once a great guy. He watched over us kids and stood up for us. But he was so greedy that he was willing to either let me die in his house alone or go to jail for it. What kind of man does that to a kid? I was angry and hurt all over again. I was happy that my mom told me, relieved that it was finally outed that I wasn't a crazy fire kid, but I still hold that anger towards him. I thought about trying to visit him to get answers straight from him, but I decided that it wasn't worth it. I finally got answers and I could move on, knowing that the truth was out there. So, just remember, there are always 2 sides to every story. Hi, Raven. One of your podcasts had sparked this memory from me, and I hope that you find it interesting. When I was younger, I don't remember the age, I just know I was single digits, maybe between 7 and 9 years old, I used to have a hard time falling asleep. My grandma, who took care of me and my sister as well as a number of our cousins from time to time, my sister and I didn't have our parents in our lives. They are alive, just not good people, aside from my dad. The room set up where us girls were was one bunk bed on the far wall, where a window was, and one single bed where one side was pressed against the wall. I can't remember what led us all to be so terrified to sleep alone, but I remember my sister, who I'll call Stacy, my cousin, who we'll call Casey, were not okay with sleeping alone. So we piled into the bottom bunk. My grandma decided to come sleep with us that night, which was unusual, as my grandmother was not a nice or caring person, but it caused all three of us to be relieved. My heart is pounding just typing this out. At some point, we all fall asleep, and Casey decided to move to her bed, the top bunk. I'm not sure why, but I woke up and had the sudden urge to leave the bed, as I felt uncomfortable and needed to use the bathroom. Even as a kid, I was never disturbed by nightly bathroom visits, so this was very weird. The room was pitch black. I couldn't see anything at all. That was my first indicator that there was something off. There was a ladder, as most bunk beds have, so I remember trying to find it so I could find the edge of the bed. But when I reached out, I was met with a wall. The bunk bed was a metal one, typical for the 90s, and had an opening on all sides. I remember thinking that that was weird, so I ran my hand up and down it and followed it to see if I could find an empty space. Again, it was pitch black. I couldn't even see the wall no matter how close I got to it. I couldn't find anywhere that would allow me to get out, so I resorted to waking my grandma. I knew that she would be livid, but wetting the bed would have made her more angry, so I was willing to take the whooping for waking her. Here's where things became scary for my young self. There was no one else in the bed with me. Stacy and my grandmother were no longer asleep in that bed. At this point, I became frantic. I was sobbing and running my hands along where I thought the ladder was, and then tried where I thought the window was, hoping I could feel the curtain to pull it aside and shed some light into the room. No matter where I placed my hand, I was met with a wall. Smooth, lukewarm wall. I couldn't find an out. I didn't know what to do, so I tried hitting the walls and calling for my grandma, sister, cousin, but no one came. It was as if I was trapped somewhere else and not in our tiny 3-bed room. Something told me that panicking like this wouldn't help. Then a weird sense of calm came over me. Like I knew if I focused on imagining myself back in that room, I would be back. So I took quite a few deep breaths. I have no idea how my young mind knew this would work. I stopped crying and imagined the walls gone. I closed my eyes, counted to 10, opened my eyes, and then reached for the ladder. The wall was gone and the pitch black lifted like a light switch being flipped. The ladder was back and so was my sister. I got up to use the bathroom. The power of my grandma's whoopings were no joke. Alternate reality or not, I was not wetting that bed. When I got up to go, Grandma was awake in her room and asked me why I was up. When she saw my face tear-streaked in red, she asked what was wrong, and I remember just saying, I had to go potty, but I couldn't see, so I got scared. I don't know why I didn't tell her what really happened. I think I was scared that she wouldn't believe me, but I never did. To this day, I still don't know what happened, but I know that it was real. I suffer from sleep paralysis brought on from PTSD, but the things that I see when I'm in those dreams is enough for me to constantly question if we are alone on this plane. Maybe I'll share one of those stories, but for now, I hope that you enjoyed this one, Raven. Hi, Raven. You recently read one of my stories, and I mentioned that I had content that would keep you busy for months. So, I decided to put pen to paper and share another experience. What I'm about to share was 100% not a dream. It was one of the most real things I have ever experienced. This is going a ways back, but fortunately, my childhood friend told me to write my dreams and paranormal experiences down, as I have many of them. She explained that keeping a journal or record of them helps us understand the dreams, messages, themes, and makes better connections or sense of them. I took her advice and started keeping a journal about my dreams and paranormal experiences after the death of my aunt. In March of 2015, my favorite aunt passed away. I was exceptionally close to this aunt, and I took her death very hard. In fact, I grieved her death for several years after. This aunt was an identical twin. Her twin had died in April of 1989 and lived in another country. My twin aunts were very special to me because they raised my father, as my grandmother died when he was a baby. The twins were about 16 years older than my father. Their father, my grandfather, remarried soon after my biological grandmother passed away. The twins' new stepmother was very abusive to my father when he was a baby, and she was very unkind to my twin aunts. The twins soon moved out of the family home and they took my father and raised him. Honestly, I'm forever indebted to the twins and the two other aunts that worked together to raise my father. One of the twin aunts owned a home in the United States. This is the aunt that meant the world to me. Sadly, March of 2015 marked a great loss in my life and left a gaping hole in my life. This story is about her. So, in June of 2017, I went to bed on a Wednesday night, and in the wee hours of the morning on Thursday, around 4:15, I woke up and sat straight up in my bed. Incidentally, I am certain of the dates and times as I referred to a journal entry before writing this. Anyways, upon waking up, I realized my husband was already up and out of bed. He left the house for the gym as he typically does before going to work. I felt his absence on his side of the bed, and suddenly I became wide awake. Normally, I know that his absence from the bed in the wee hours of the morning means he was either downstairs getting ready for his commute and long work day, or he was at the gym. This would not be cause for alarm. In fact, it would be reason for me to roll over onto his side and fall into an even deeper slumber. Not on this day. So, when I slid my hand over to his empty side of the bed, something felt unusual. I didn't know what, though. But I suddenly became wide awake, as if I had had my morning caffeine fix and the jolt following. It was as if I went from a full-on deep sleep state to a full-on awake state with not even a hint of grogginess in between. This is quite rare for me, so it definitely felt strange to say the least. Anyways, I sat up, fully alert, my eyes wide open, and I looked over at the oversized yellow chair in the corner of my bedroom. There, sitting right in my chair, was my aunt, Janine, the aunt that had passed away in 2015. It was as if she was sitting there quietly waiting for me to wake up and see her sitting there. Oddly enough, I wasn't scared. I knew in that moment that she was dead, but all I felt was a bit of surprise and ultimately joy to see her again. My aunt was not a ghost. She was not transparent. She looked exactly like herself, only healthier. She was as solid and as real as any person. In fact, she actually looked better than she did before she had died. I'd say she looked as if she had been on a long tropical vacation. Her face was full of life and color. Her skin had a glow that radiated light that isn't something we'd see on living people. I mean, she still looked like an 88-year-old woman, but she looked healthy, vibrant, and overall amazing. Especially with this heavenly glow. Our conversation was telepathic. I asked her what she was doing. We talked telepathically for what seemed like quite a long time. Although I don't remember everything we discussed during our conversation, I clearly remember that she told me that everything that I was concerned about in life, with my kids, and my job, was going to work out great. And I didn't have to worry about it anymore. At one point, the conversation took a bit of a negative turn. I began sharing with her that I was still grieving because she was no longer alive. I became sad and teary as I expressed this to her. I told her I missed her very much and I wanted to go with her. She told me no, that I couldn't go with her. Then she stood up and walked out of the bedroom, down the hall, and down the stairs. I watched her slowly disappear right before my eyes. She literally faded right before my eyes. I followed her as she slowly faded, reaching for her. I was trailing behind her essence as she faded down the stairs and into the kitchen. I was audibly crying now and begging her to come back. Suddenly, something told me to go back into my bed and that she would be back, so I did. I ran back upstairs and climbed into my bed, obeying this seed that was planted into my mind. I wanted my aunt to come back and visit me. I felt our conversation wasn't over. As I went up the stairs to return to my bed, I was aware that my kids were still asleep and that my husband was still at the gym. I'm not sure how long I was in bed for because I kept looking over at the clock, knowing that I would have to get up and get ready for work at 5:45 a.m. It couldn't have been very long, though. I was awake and I heard a noise coming from the kitchen downstairs. It prompted me to call out to what I assumed was my husband. I thought the noise in the kitchen was him returning from the gym, but it wasn't him. He still had not come back just yet. So, I adjusted my body and tried to get comfortable in hope that my aunt would return. I turned over onto my side, faced the oversized yellow chair in the corner of my bedroom, and pulled the blankets back over me. At that moment, I glanced at the yellow chair and my Aunt Janine was sitting there. She came back. But something was different about her. She had changed her outfit. I know this sounds insane, but she came back with a totally different outfit on. Now, my aunts were some of the most fashionable women I have ever known. In life, they were notorious for changing their outfits 3 or 4 times a day. They were real clothes horses. As my aunt sat there, she was now wearing a cotton button-down shirt that was light-colored. The shirt had a delicate floral print, and this time she had on a pair of shorts, but not too short. I found it strange that she had changed her clothes. After all, she was dead. So even though I thought it was weird, I didn't ask her why she changed her clothes. I guess I was just so glad that she came back. As I sat in my bed and examined her outfit change, I was focused on the texture of her shirt and the print of the fabric of her shirt. It looked familiar. Months after this experience, I reviewed old photographs only to discover the shirt she wore during the visitation was the same shirt she wore the last time she came to the United States, and to my home. As I looked her outfit over, I noticed the familiar veins in her hands. Not to be unkind, but my aunt had veiny hands, and for a very tiny woman under 100 pounds, her hands and fingers were somewhat less than delicate. Her hands were all too familiar. Once again, my aunt telepathically told me that she has to go now and that I couldn't come with her. I was now sitting upright in my bed. She walked over and she hugged me tightly. I felt her 2 hands on my upper back. I have never felt something more real. This was the deepest, most penetrating hug that I have ever felt. It touched me deep into the depths of my soul. This angelic hug isn't something that can easily be described. That heavenly feeling stayed with long after she left. After she hugged me, she grabbed my 2 hands and squeezed them tightly. I looked down and saw her square-shaped fingers and her veiny hands as they squeezed mine. She told me that she loved me and that she would never leave me. The hug she gave me is one that I will never forget. I felt completely at peace. Then, once again, she vanished. Afterwards, I stood up, left the bedroom, went downstairs and looked all around the house, tearfully looking for her again. At which point my husband walked into the kitchen. He saw me crying as I walked from room to room looking for my aunt. He asked me what happened as he saw how distraught I was, and I told him what I had just experienced. I thought that he wouldn't believe me or he would think that I was dreaming, but he just knew. He saw it on my face. He knew that she really had come to see me. He told me he fully believed she had just visited me and he wasn't even surprised. He understood that special bond that we had. This visitation was an experience that left me physically and mentally exhausted for a few days. I felt as if I hadn't slept in a week. So on top of this visitation that took place on a Thursday, a few days later, the next Monday morning, my aunt's son, my cousin, sends me a text while I'm at work. His text message came at a very unusual time as he almost never texts me. This particular Monday morning, when I arrived at work, we had an emergency faculty meeting before school began. I'm both a college professor and an elementary school teacher. This faculty meeting and situation took place at the elementary school, not the university. We were told that half of the building would be closed off and students in this wing would be relocated to other areas and join other classrooms in the building until pest control dealt with a bat situation. There were bats spotted in the other wing of the building. Obviously, the teachers didn't want to create mass hysteria with students and their families, but truth be told, I'm terrified of birds and bats. So, needless to say, my anxiety level inside of me was elevated. The bird/bat fear likely stemmed from having a red-tailed hawk swoop down at me and graze my cheek once when running in the park. Either that or having some insane teachers show the Alfred Hitchcock movie The Birds when I was in 6th grade. That would be scarring to any young child. Anyhow, that's a story for another day. Just know that flying creatures have always freaked me out. So around 9:30 a.m. on this particular Monday, I look at my cell phone on my desk only to be surprised that I got a text message from my cousin. Before I read the text, I was worried that it was some bad news about another elderly relative in decline. Thankfully, it wasn't. Instead, it was a picture of my aunt with her arms spread out and a bunch of giant birds all over her arms. The text said, "Here is someone to brighten your day." Honestly, I just found it so ironic that at that very moment, right there in that elementary school with a flying bat situation, my cousin that almost never texts me decides to send me this random picture of my aunt. A tiny old lady with all these giant birds on her arms and head, from when she was in Costa Rica on a vacation years ago when she was alive. It was as if my aunt was reminding me not to worry about anything. In a weird twist, my fear about birds and bats melted away in that moment, and I felt that same feeling of peace wash over me, the same way I did after I felt her angelic hug. I think my fear melted away because that texted picture of her in that very moment was a clear reminder that, although she is no longer living, she is still with me, just like she promised. She said she would always be with me. I've been a trucker for a good 24 years now, and I've seen, heard, and hell, even smelled some crazy things on my time on the road. From bad road rage cases, to damn near being the cause to the end of a high-speed chase, and finding some pretty weird things on the side of the road. I feel like I've seen it all. But this one thing I experienced back in 2008 still has me shrugging my shoulders with no explanation in sight. It was about mid-December. I was on a pretty desolate stretch of highway in northern Montana, heading to my second pickup in North Dakota. The weather was getting pretty bad due to a hellacious snowstorm that was on the way, and kind of in the midst of. The roads were already pretty well covered, and with the wind and the snowfall, you had to be very careful in a big rig. One wrong move or one jerk not giving you enough room could make for a pretty bad day. I was fairly used to driving in this stuff at that point, so I knew the steps to take to control and stay in control of the situation. I was a stickler for rules and following all the safety protocols, and because of that, I was cool and calm, knowing that I would be okay. I was listening to music until around 2 a.m. when I started getting some chatter on my radio. Sometimes truckers will share road conditions or just shoot the breeze to keep each other awake. It's always on a random channel, separate from our normal dispatch channels, but I like to tune in at times and join in on the antics. But this time it caught my attention for a couple of reasons. The first one was that I don't remember changing my channel. I still had it on my dispatch, or so I thought, so it was odd to not hear Rhonda's voice. And, leading into the second reason, it was a man's voice, and instead of things that I would normally hear from Rhonda, or the other guys messing around, this guy's voice was low and gravelly, and all I heard was, "Is anyone there?" At first, I didn't reply, waiting to see what was going on, but there was no reply after his third hello, so I answered. "Hey, this is Chief. What's up, boss?" What I didn't expect was his response. "Help. Please. Anyone?" I was immediately concerned. Was this another trucker that was maybe in an accident? Or maybe there was a medical emergency, so I asked if he was okay, and again, all I got was, "Please, it's so cold. Truck won't start." Now I was worried for him. If his truck wouldn't start, maybe he was in an accident, or maybe it just broke down. But the fact that he was complaining about being cold made me think he was exposed to the elements. This was a pretty large and empty strip of highway, so who knows if anyone else has even been through there since this accident. I knew that I had to stop. I knew that I had to find this guy and help. "What's your 20, boss?" I asked him. After a pause, he finally responded. "Mile marker 247. Please don't leave me." I knew where that was. I told him I was about 12 miles out and to hang tight, and he responded with, "Don't forget about me." I switched back to my dispatch and told them about the trucker and the accident, and said I was stopping for them, and they confirmed that they heard me. When I approached 247, I slowed down and started looking a lot closer to the roads and shoulder. I was expecting to see a rig somewhere, but I didn't see one. I thought maybe he was toward the end of 247, so I slowed and pulled over to the shoulder. I tried to radio the guy again, remembering what channel I was on, but there was nothing there but static. I waited a few minutes and then started to put it back into drive to go further down the road when I finally got a response. "Please, I'm cold." I told him that I couldn't see anyone or anything from where I was. I had been keeping an eye out and slowed down when I hit 246, but there was nothing around. I knew that I hadn't passed anyone or anything. Even in a snowstorm, it's kind of hard to miss a big rig. I again radioed to him saying I was here and asked for a better idea of where he was. "I see you, Chief. Don't you see me?" I was confused. I definitely did not see anyone around, so I got out of my truck and looked around again. I don't know why I thought I would be able to see any better out there, but I certainly couldn't. It was dark, the wind was painfully cold, but the silence was deafening. There wasn't a single soul in sight, so where the hell was this guy? As I walked back to my truck, I started to get a little annoyed. What if someone was just pulling a prank? Now they've interrupted my route and got me out in the cold for no reason. So I called out to the guy one more time, but I was probably a little more angry with my tone. I told him that I hadn't seen anything and that I didn't appreciate being messed with. I then tried to ask for their name or who they were contracting with, but I didn't get anything back. This only irritated me more. I felt that they were messing with me and that's why they weren't answering. I ended up calling it into my dispatch, mentioning a distress call I heard, but that I couldn't see anybody. Just as a precaution to see if they could either send an emergency vehicle to check it out, or something like that, but that was it. I tried looking. I was starting to feel like a dumbass for actually stopping, but at least if it was real, I sensed someone who could probably do more than what I could. I started my truck back up and slowly pulled off the shoulder. Now, at this point, I was back on with my dispatch channel. I had no reason to turn back, but yet, there his voice was again.
"Thanks anyways, Chief."
And that was it. I tried to ask him what he meant. Was he messing with me? Just give me some kind of answer, but there was nothing. Not until I heard Rhonda's voice asking me to repeat what I had said. Apparently, Rhonda had heard what I was saying to the other guy, but she also heard the guy thank me. He seemed to be on the same channel now as us. She asked me if that was the guy that I was talking about and tried to get him to respond, but it was back to nothing. He never spoke to us again. Rhonda said that she would pass along the information, being even more willing to, I guess, after hearing the guy for herself. Rhonda listens to all of us frequently. She knows our voices. She told me that she did not recognize his voice either. As for me, I just kept on going, thinking back to that whole situation over and over. Fast forward past the long, boring part of the route, and I'm now heading back home to Idaho, and I made a stop in Montana again for some breakfast. While there, I was reading a newspaper that nearly made me lose my mind. There was a story about a truck that had run off the road and flipped down into an embankment. The driver was dead by the time anyone arrived. No one knows why it happened or what caused the accident, and it said the investigation was still ongoing as to his cause of death, as they were still unsure if it was what may have caused the accident, or if he died because of it. The problem I had with this was that the newspaper was older, about a week or two. I don't remember the exact date, but the story mentioned the truck and the man was found at mile marker 247. A man died in that same location that I was in about a week before I was there. I definitely didn't see any trucks on the road, on the shoulder, or in the embankment. Was this a new accident? Was this someone who knew the story and was trying to play a really sick joke? Or was it the man that died? Was he still out there trying to come to terms with his own demise? I brought the newspaper back with me to show some folks, and they all seemed to think it was a prank, but I believe in spirits. There are things out there that we don't understand, because we can't and probably never will, and quite honestly, shouldn't. Some things just need to be left alone. And part of me wonders if maybe he was trying to call for help one last time. Maybe he was unable to the first time, and maybe he was trying to replay the events? I don't know for sure, and I know that I never will know, but I hope the sincerity in his voice when he thanked me was real. I hope if that really was the case that I was able to give him some relief in knowing that maybe he wasn't alone in his last moments, and that someone was really there, or trying to be there for him. This may be a little different than normal stories you hear, but it was still a terrifying moment for me and, well, everyone involved, actually. I have been enjoying spelunking and exploring caves for quite some time. Throughout my childhood, my family lived close to some caves that were often explored by those of us that live here, as well as plenty of tourists. I was not immune to it either. I loved going to the caves with my parents. That love only grew as I got older, and it became a pretty normal activity for my friends and I. We liked to go out to the caves on the weekends, or depending on how much time we have, for a week. We can go to the same cave multiple times and find new paths or veins that we would have to wiggle through, but it was always worth it. No challenge was too much for my squad. There were typically 4 to 5 of us total. Myself, Steven, Drew, Drew's girlfriend Angie, and sometimes Angie's friend Liz. All of us were big cave people, and we all knew what to do in difficult and dangerous situations, but sometimes you just don't know what you would do until you're in that very situation. We went into this cave that was less ventured in. It wasn't very big, and for those that don't do this as a hobby, they probably wouldn't find the beauty in it. It didn't have any minerals in it, or plants growing in neat crevices. In fact, there was quite a large boulder that nearly blocked the entrance, but once you got past it, the back of the little cave was dark and serene. There was a small stream of water that was coming from the cracks in one of the walls, but otherwise, it was silent. It was peaceful, and it was one of our favorite places to go. Once past the boulder and down the small drop, there was a small rounded area that we liked to sit in and just BS and chill. We would bring some snacks and just sit around and enjoy our time. We never drank or smoked when we were in the caves. You needed to be at your best in these situations because you never knew what could happen. This time was no different. We had a few things to eat and plans to be there for a few hours. The first step was getting past the boulder-like door stopping us. The boulder was easily 15 to 20 feet tall and wide enough to nearly block the path. There was a slight gap underneath it that I'm sure you could probably squeeze under, but no one was brave enough to do that, not knowing when or what could cause the boulder to finally fall. It seemed to be remaining in place by the slightly narrower ceiling of the cave. So, as for getting past it, there were 2 paths you could take to get by it. The first option was on the right, which was a very narrow path where you had to be standing with your back to the cave wall, nose to the boulder, and step left and right, shimmying your way through. However, I had a little pudge on me and I wasn't comfortable sucking in and holding my breath to get by it. So I preferred the alternative route. This meant jumping up, grabbing onto the boulder, and kind of propelling yourself off the other side. It was pretty simple. You just needed the upper body strength to do it. We've all taken both paths before, but we also all had our preferences. I liked the top left jump as well as Steven and Liz. Angie was a very small girl, so she was comfortable with the shimmy path. Drew didn't seem to mind either way, but typically went with Angie. Liz would also typically follow Angie, but once she took the high grounds, she preferred it. We got past it and settled into our spot for the next few hours. We ate, we talked about life, and Drew even seemed to doze off for a bit. This was what I liked about this place. It was always so peaceful and a great place to get away. Then we started hearing the familiar sounds of strong winds whistling past the large boulder. The strong winds told us that there may have been a storm coming, and no matter how much you may know a cave, it's not best to be in there during a storm. Who knew how much it could flood? We packed up and headed back to the boulder, ready to leave. Liz went over first, then Steven, while Drew and Angie took the lower right path. I typically went last. Once Steven was out of view, I jumped up on the boulder, and that's when everything went horribly wrong. As I pushed myself on top of the boulder, I could feel a vibrating in the boulder, and my heart dropped, as well as the boulder. Everything was in slow motion at that moment. I quickly jumped off the side and heard the piercing scream from Angie, followed by a loud thud from the boulder and then silence. That boulder had come loose on our side and slid down the only way it could, into the open gap on the right. Drew began yelling for Angie, and we all hesitantly looked for her. All we could see were her fingers sticking out from the boulder. She wasn't responding. Steven and I had to try to stop Drew from trying to do something careless. If he tried pushing or climbing over the boulder, he could wedge it tighter. He was too emotional to try and climb under it, nor would we let him. It had already slipped. It was entirely possible it would do it again. While he was under it, I told Liz to get out and call for help, as we didn't get a signal in the cave, so we left our phones in the truck. Once we got Drew calmed down, we had to figure out what to do about Angie. We couldn't see anything else but her fingers being crushed between the wall and the boulder, and it wasn't looking good. But then, right as we were talking about options, there was a groan. It was Angie. We listened as Drew tried to talk to her and get her to respond, but she started crying. She said that she couldn't feel her right arm and leg, and that her hair was stuck. She had slightly longer hair and it was pulled up into a ponytail that day, so I assumed she probably turned her head to flinch and her hair got caught, as well as her limbs. She was alive, but there was no way we were going to be able to get her out on our own. Liz came back and said she had called for help, but it was going to take them some time to get to us. The only thing we could be thankful for was that the boulder was probably stopping her from bleeding out somewhere. It took rescuers about 15 minutes to get there, and they inspected the situation. Angie was responsive but seemed to be fading. She said that she felt cold and tired. We had to wait even longer for people to bring the equipment to get her out. They drilled through part of the boulder near the bottom so they could crawl through. Once on the other side and able to see Angie, they could better determine a course of action. Once there, they mentioned trying to drill out part of the boulder to pull her leg out since it was lower. However, based on where her arm was against the wall and boulder and by the looks of her fingertips, her arm was practically dead, and the best thing they could do would be to amputate it. It was awful. Drew and Angie were both hesitant. They didn't want to, were begging for any other option, but finally Angie calmed down and accepted it. She understood that in order to get out, this was her only option. There was a very small chance that her arm could be saved if she got out without it anyways. So they gave her some anesthetic and went about it. I could still hear Angie crying and the grinding as the saw, or whatever they used, went through the bone. I felt sick. This was my fault. I should have made sure that they were through before I climbed over the boulder. All I needed to do was call out, and I didn't. And because of that, I almost killed my friend. Now she was losing her arm and possibly her leg because of me. I was a mess. Steven having to help me out of the cave and into my truck when they finally got her out. I don't even remember the ride to the hospital. I just remember being helped into the back of my truck. I don't even remember them taking Angie away or Liz talking to Steven on the way there. I sat in the waiting room with everyone else, waiting for an update. Angie was going to survive, but obviously not unscathed. Once they were able to get her arm out, they confirmed that it had been dead before they even got the equipment there. The bone was crushed and the boulder cut the circulation off. Her femur was partially crushed and her thigh torn open to the muscle too, but she was able to keep her leg. She also had a few broken ribs. The boulder did catch her hair too, which had to be cut off, but that was a lot less serious, as you could imagine. She had to go through physical therapy due to her femur being replaced, but she was a trooper. She never gave up and worked so hard to get back to being independent. She even got fitted with the prosthetic arm since it was her right, and also her dominant arm and hand. I never got over my guilt, but I have gotten better about it. We had a long talk, and she demanded that I not ever feel bad. She said that she also should have checked and that there were no reasons that I should ever take the blame for it. She also explained her moment as it happened. She said that she felt the boulder move, and instead of trying to scoot back into the cave since she was closer to that side, she just froze and said that she blamed herself for that. We both agreed that it was a crazy series of events. We grieved, and then we told each other it was time to move forward, and that's what we did. We all still go caving, Angie included, but we're all a lot more aware of our surroundings and options. We became obsessive about safety, triple-checking everything and making sure paths were clear before we did anything. It's been a real eye-opener to even us, people that do this on a regular basis. And I wanted to share this as a reminder. No matter how confident you are in doing something, no matter how much of a pro you are never good enough to not have to make sure you're doing it in the safest way possible. You are never good enough to outsmart nature. Stay safe. This was back in the early 90s. My parents had gone to Reno for the weekend. This left me home alone for the entire weekend. Now, I was a boring kid. I was 13 years old and was just excited that I could stay home and play video games all weekend. On Friday night, I cooked up some pizzas from a delivery service called Schwann's. I had put a couple of sodas in the fridge to chill, and then I hooked up my Nintendo, that my dad hardly ever let me play. I would maybe get a half hour a day at best. That was when he fell asleep on the couch. Even then, most of the time when I went to play, he would wake up enough to say, "I'm watching that." No joke. This man would be snoring on the couch, but if you touched the remote, he would wake up and say, "Hey, I'm watching that." It's hard to describe how frustrating it was, that between snores he would hold conversations. I now know that he was suffering from an advanced case of sleep apnea. Sorry, I'm just trying to explain how excited I was to be able to play for a few hours straight. So, there I am, sitting in front of the TV the first night, and I get this weird, oppressive feeling. I had mowed through one of the little pizzas and one of the sodas. Now, I was trying to take my time on the next set. I just couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. To my right was a large bank of windows. It was an 80s double-wide that had a bank of windows facing the driveway. Looking out there, I couldn't see anything, nor was our inside dog barking, or the outside dog. They are both very protective of the place and good guard dogs. So, I let it go as much as I could and went back to playing. That was all it really was the first night. Just an oppressive feeling. The second night, Saturday, I had the same thing planned, but this was the last night, so I had wanted to stay up as late as I could. I had cooked up a bunch of the pizzas and chilled the whole half rack of the soda. I kept playing and drinking soda, occasionally getting one of the pizzas. As the night wore on, that oppressive feeling came back with a vengeance. Like Harry and Marge from Home Alone were skulking somewhere, but again, neither dog seemed to be bothered. So, I turned to face the window a little more, still keeping my eyes on the TV. After another little while, I thought I saw something outside. A black little shape ran by the window, just like our inside dog. I thought she had gotten out, so I got up and went to let her in. When I opened the door, she came running from the back bedroom ready to bark at the person at the door. No one was there. I chalked it up to a cat or something going by the window. I sat back down and picked up where I left off. As I was getting back into the game, out of the corner of my eye I saw another shape move in the front yard. This one was larger, about man-sized, but I didn't get a good look. This freaked me out. It was like someone was dressed in all black running in my yard. The problem was that they were not alerting my dogs. Holly, the inside one, didn't even look up from her perch on the couch. Cindy, the outside one, was silent. This scared me. I was afraid that whoever it was may have hurt her. So I went to my room and grabbed Excalibur. Yes, I named my bat that. It was just a solid wooden bat. However, I had jammed rocks and bits of metal into it because it was splitting. I don't know why I did this, other than I was 13 and liked exploring the desert. So I got up to go outside and check on Cindy. I turn on all the outside lights and walk around the house to check to see if she was at her house. There she was, wagging her tail and happy to see me. There seemed to be nothing wrong, so I pet her and tell her she's a good girl. I just had to guess that I was being paranoid at being home alone for the first time. My older sister had just moved out, so I was the last kid at home. I go back in, determined to get some more gaming in. I ignored the black shadow at the edge of my vision. The volume was up on the TV, so I couldn't hear anything from outside. I just kept playing. But then, the shadow started to gain color. It was like whatever it was moving closer to the window. I looked over and it was a horde of barbarians. Like, straight out of my video game. They looked like they were coming for my blood. Thank God my rational mind kicked in, and I knew what I was seeing couldn't be real. That was actually how I found out that certain fake sugars cause me to see things. The soda I had been drinking was a diet one. So, to this day, I still remember seeing the salivating horde of weapon-wielding barbarians at my window. I can look back on it and laugh now, but that night, I had both Holly and Cindy in my room with me when I went to bed. And thanks for taking the time to read this. I've been a long-haul trucker for over 2 decades now, and I've learned that I quite enjoy listening to podcasts such as yours and other similar ones over music. It seems to keep my mind more occupied and thinking, especially on those long, boring stretches of road. But sometimes us truckers have our own stories to share, and I would like to share one of those with you today. This happened when I was younger, late 20s and around 2012. I know it was quite some time ago, but the events were so bizarre, I will never forget the details. I was much more spry and bright at that age. The job was still somewhat new to me, and I was excited. I always wanted to travel all over, and this was a good way to do it. I smiled and talked to anyone that I could. I sampled different restaurants and local stores, and took even more pictures than I knew what to do with. Around that time, hitchhikers were also pretty common at the start of long stretches of highway, and while it was still risky, some people tried to find the good in others and to help out. I was often one of those people. Thankfully, I never really had a bad experience. Most people were more than willing to tell me how they got there, where they've been, their regrets, and accomplishments. I always enjoyed practically living through them as I listened to their stories. I had a few people who weren't interested in talking, which was fine. Even though they didn't talk much, if at all, I knew they still appreciated the ride. But there was one experience with a hitchhiker that I picked up that was nothing like any of my other passengers. It was around midnight, and I was, as usual, on a long haul from Sacramento to Denver. I could get by with only a few hours of sleep, and I was trying to push myself to the next stop, which would take me close to an hour. As I drove along, I had to do a double take as I saw someone ahead on the shoulder walking along. It was strange because it was midnight and on a long stretch of empty highway. Where did they even come from? But as I approached them, I was shocked to realize that it was a woman. Women weren't uncommon, necessarily, but we typically saw them closer to rest stops, diners, and the sort. Not in the middle of nowhere in the dark. Now, of course, most might think that's pretty suspicious, but against my better judgment, I stopped. I didn't even hesitate because I felt like she needed help. I stopped shortly after where she stood, and I saw her running towards my truck in the mirror. Unlike others who ask where I'm going and if it's okay to tag along, she jumps in immediately, slamming the door shut and locking it. She looked distressed and like she had been out there for a while. She was wearing a large sweater and shorts with no shoes. Her hair looked like it hadn't been brushed for days, and she was breathing really fast. "Drive," she said. "Please just drive, don't stop." I hadn't even been able to say anything to her yet, but she sounded pretty scared. I put my truck back in drive and got on the road. We drove in silence for a few minutes, and I watched as she kept checking the mirror. I asked her if she was alright or if I needed to call for someone on the radio, but she just shook her head. No, I just want to get out of here before they catch up, please. I know some people might just think she was crazy, but if she was willing to get into a truck with a big and mean-looking trucker, then she must have really been desperate. I was certainly less worried for my safety, and more for hers. Was someone after her? And who? Why? I tried asking her who she was running from and what was going on, but she was in tears at this point, still shaking her head. I dropped it, not wanting to push her, and told myself that I just needed to find the first police station and take her there. We drove in silence for about 10 minutes or so, when she finally spoke again. They tried to make me sick, so I couldn't run away, but I just spat it back out. They want me to be like them. They don't want me to be human. Okay, so maybe the next stop was Crazy Town, right? But there was something in her voice. Something that made me think this was a real fear. I didn't want to scare her and wanted to keep her calm, so I told her that she was safe now and that she could stay with me as long as she wanted. She nodded and wiped her face and then went back to staring out the window or at the mirror. It wasn't much longer that I saw lights in my mirror as a car caught up with us. I ignored it at first, cars happened, and eventually it would pass me anyways. But surprisingly, they never did. In fact, they honked. The woman immediately sat back up and looked in the mirror. Oh my god, they found me. They're here. I tried asking her who, but she was hysterical at this point. I was not getting through to her, and for a moment, I was worried about who I had just picked up. But as the car continued to honk behind me, I knew I had to do something about it. Okay, maybe part of that was more the curiosity in me, but still. I didn't want someone following behind me and honking. So, I pulled over. As soon as the woman noticed this, she started screaming at me to not stop and to not let them take her. I didn't want to touch her to make things worse on her, but I held my hands up and kept repeating myself. I told her, I'm not going to let them take you, nor will they be able to even open the doors. I'm just going to try to get them to leave us alone. She continued to cry, but otherwise calmed down. I watched as two men wearing black got out of the car, and they approached each side of my truck. The guy on my side reached my door first, and I kid you not, the guy was wearing sunglasses. It was the middle of the night. He stepped up onto my truck, took his glasses off, and smiled at me. I cracked the window just enough to hear him, but I could already hear her breathing start to shake. The man just said, "Evening," and she lost it. It's them, please don't let them take me." The guy continued smiling. "Thank you for picking her up. She ran off when we were trying to give her a bath, and we worried about where she would end up due to her mental state." The guy said something about taking her home, and before I could even respond, the woman started screaming again. "I'm not crazy. I know who I am and what I was doing before they grabbed me. They're not even human. Why can't you see that?" There was a brief moment where I was caught in between, and I didn't know what to do. I shouldn't have even stopped in the first place, per my company's policy. But now I have a woman screaming that these men were not human, and the guy's claiming she's crazy. I know a lot of people would probably side with the men, probably, but the look in her eyes was pure terror. It wasn't of someone out of their mind. It wasn't the sight of someone lying or delusional. She was pressed against my side, trying to avoid both windows, and she looked terrified. And maybe some might call me crazy too, but something definitely did not feel right, and my fight or flight was kicking in. So, I took a deep breath to calm my nerves and told the men that she was free to go with them, if she wanted to. The guy on the passenger side said nothing, but the guy on my side chuckled. and tried to make a comment about how she was required to go with them. I cut him off and said that it was her choice. She said she wanted to stay with me, and the man said something about calling his superior, so I challenged him. I told him to go for it, that I would radio into mine as well and let them know my location, and that I had a situation. That seemed to speak to him because he went back to his smile, and then they said that they would catch up to her later, and thanked me for again picking her up. Then they both walked off back to the car and sat there. I was too nervous to leave, thinking they would just continue to follow me, so I waited too. I could feel the poor girl next to me shaking, and I could hear her rapid breaths as we sat there for probably a good 15 to 20 minutes before the car finally left. I still called it in since I had been idle for some time, and I let them know that something came up, but that was it. The car slowly drove by us, and after I could no longer see their lights, I started my rig back up. As we drove, the woman gradually calmed down and thanked me through her quiet sobs. I tried to act like I wasn't equally freaked out, and just gave a shrug saying that it was no big deal. I didn't want to push her and get her worked up again, but I seriously had a lot of questions. Why was she in the middle of nowhere on a pretty empty highway? Why were those guys looking for her, and most importantly, why did she think they weren't human? I know the most sane answer was probably that she was mentally unstable, but like I said, the fear in her eyes was real, and it was damn near palpable. I asked her if there was some place that she wanted me to take her, or if she just wanted to go as far as she could with me, and she chose the latter. She fell asleep shortly after, and I decided to keep driving because there was no way that I was sleeping now. She slept in small bursts, constantly waking up to any bump or loud talking from my radio, and would look around. Finally, that morning as the sun was rising, she asked if I could drop her off at a police station. I agreed, without asking any questions, and picked up my radio to see if dispatch could tell me where the closest one was in the city that I was about to hit. I just gave them a line about finding a wallet in a parking lot, and they gave me directions. When I got to the station, the woman told me that she didn't want to risk my life, in case they found out who I was, and tried to do the same to me for helping her. She said that she would call one of her friends from the station to help get her home. She then shook my hand, said that her name was Gloria, and thanked me again, and then she left. I waited until she walked into the station, and then I waited a few more minutes, making sure she didn't come back out screaming something again. After she left, I won't lie to you, I was worried for her. I wanted to make sure she was okay and would be okay, but I was also left with a ton of questions. Was there any truth to her statements about those guys not being human? Was the feeling of dread I got when they approached just my fight or flight? Or was there something more to it, and to her claims? I don't think that I will ever know, but hopefully, wherever she is today, she's safe and happy. I woke up, and there wasn't a sound around, which is unusual, since I have a fan and a TV on all night. I look next to me, and my partner's out cold. Here's a little insight. We're both gamers, I work 40 hours a week and go to school online as well. Let's just call him C for the story. I get up every morning for work at 2:30 a.m. I leave by 2:45 a.m. and get to work by 2:55. Of course, it's creepy at 3 a.m. opening a gas station by myself until the cashiers get there, but I never pay attention until recently. It started when my mom and her ex broke up. The whole air around us seemed to change for the better. That was until my nephew woke up one night after everyone in the house heard a loud bang, and he was inconsolable. He never went back to bed that night, but I had an early appointment the next morning that we all went to. After getting home, everyone went back to bed. Later that day, they left, leaving me and C home alone, and that's when the voices started. They sound like people in the house calling to us, talking. Whatever it is, we refused to leave the room. Now, fast forward a few days later, and I've been seeing a tall shadow following me all the way to work, and he hangs outside of our house. Being Wiccan, I know not to engage with it or show it fear, but I'm starting to get freaked out. We know that we have haunted items, but this is new. Side note, all the haunted items are usually saged or kept safely, to not disrespect nor disturb whatever it is that's attached. This happened to me last year, and is something that still gives me the heebie-jeebies whenever I think about it. I had just moved into a cute little studio apartment downtown. It was pretty typical of a studio apartment, not huge or anything, but well built, and I was able to organize it comfortably for myself since I live alone. I was on the top floor of the building, which was a pain when I moved in, but I was pretty excited about having my own place for the first time. I had just turned 22, and my roommates and I decided to part ways after 2 years of disagreements. One night, I was home and sitting in my dimly lit work area, just working away on my laptop. It must have been around 1 a.m. My windows were open because it was a lovely night, and all I could hear were the crickets and the occasional car that passed by the building. I was getting into the flow of my work when I thought I heard something. I had my earphones in, but I had them in pass-through so I could hear the noise. I paused my music and looked around, trying to figure out what it was I was hearing. After a few seconds, it kind of clicked that it was a scratching sound, like something was scratching on wood. Initially, I tried to ignore it, thinking it was coming from downstairs or maybe it was the building settling or something, though I'm not sure why settling would sound like scratching. But it kept going. It was soft, but it was definitely there. After a few moments, my brain had honed in on it, and I couldn't ignore it. It was bothering the hell out of me. So I leaned back and just glanced around like, where the hell is that coming from? When I stood up, I realized that the scratching was definitely coming from near the front of the apartment, like near the front door. I walked over to the front door thinking that maybe I should just yank it open and confront or scare whatever it was. Maybe it was a rat or squirrel or something. But I paused and decided to just look through the viewport first to see if there was someone there, thinking that was the smarter move. I leaned forward to see if I could see anyone, but I couldn't. There wasn't anyone there. I thought that I saw a shadow off to the side, but I figured it was just the wall or something. So I stepped away and went back to my desk. Of course, that's not the end of it, because within minutes the scratching started up again. This time it sounded like whatever it was doing it more hastily, like they had sped up, trying to finish up whatever they were doing. I angrily stood up and walked over to the door and looked out the viewport again. This time there was somebody there. I could see a man that I had never seen before on the other side of my door, holding a large Bowie knife and pressing it against my door. He had this creepy grin on his face like he was practicing to be the Joker. His eyes had a 1,000-yard stare like he was looking through my door while he was running his knife across it. Obviously, I freaked the F out. I grabbed my phone and called 911, telling them there was a crazy man standing outside my door with a knife. They told me that they would send out an officer as quickly as possible. I just sat there waiting in the dark room, listening to this man scratch at my door with the knife. After a few more minutes, the scratching stopped, and I heard this weird guttural laugh, and then nothing. I stood there in silence, holding my phone in my hand, until I finally heard a knock on the door and someone yell, "Police!" I looked out again, And sure enough, there were two officers standing out in the hallway, looking at my door and pointing and talking to each other. I slowly opened it and greeted them, and the officer asked me if I had called in someone with a knife standing outside my door. I explained how I had heard the scratching noise, and when I looked out, I saw the man standing there with the knife. I described the man as best I could, and the officer asked me a strange question. He looked at me and said, by chance, is your name Tina? Now, my name is not Tina. It's not even close to Tina at all. I told him no. I told him my name and asked why. He motioned for me to step out and look at the outside of my door, and that's when I saw what the weirdo had been carving. There, in the blue paint, was a crudely carved heart with the name Tina in it. I had no idea who Tina could have been. It certainly wasn't me, and I didn't know the guy that did this. The officer said they would give me an incident report and that they would circle the area to see if they could find the guy, but they were as confused and weirded out as I was. After they left, I struggled to fall asleep, thinking I was going to start hearing the scratching again, but thankfully it seemed like this guy had moved on. The conversation with the rental office was fun the next day. I gave them the incident number, and I even asked if Tina was a former resident to my unit. And the answer was no. They didn't even have a Tina on any leases as far back as the office team could remember. They had never had anyone named Tina living on the property. So that's my creepy story. They replaced my door, and thankfully nothing else has happened since then. I'm a bit jumpy anytime I hear late-night noises in the hallways, though, and I've been on the lookout for Tina. If for no other reason than to let her know that some weird guy is carving her name into random fourth-story apartment building doors at like 1 in the morning. I love going hiking in the woods. It's one of the most relaxing things to do. You can visit the same place, and every single time it feels different. Getting away from people and the noise of the suburbs is essential. Sometimes I fantasize about running away and living permanently in the woods. Sometimes I take my family and friends out with me, and this time, I took some friends on a relatively easy trail. Not too easy that it would be a breeze for them, but nothing that would be too dangerous. We walked through chatting about nature and the wildlife that we saw, or didn't see. Along the trails are a network of caves nearby, and they were regularly frequented, so I wasn't worried about animals being inside. There are stories about the caves. Some were about how people used to live down there, that they were holding places for bounty hunters who were after enslaved people, and that serial killers would drag their victims there. For all the local tales, from what I know, there have never been any bodies or crime scenes officially found there. It is kind of ironic that people now bring their kids here to check the place out. One of my friends loves photography, and we spent hours there taking photos for her Instagram. She took some using her phone and other more professional ones with her camera. We stayed a bit too late, so it was getting dark, and we needed to head back. We weren't set up to walk during nighttime. I told them to wrap it up and that we needed to get back before dark, when I heard a scream coming from deep in the cave. I wasn't sure if it was an animal or a person. We packed up quickly, but my friend didn't want to leave in case someone was hurt. Before I could stop them, they took a flashlight and walked down into the tunnel, shining the light down to find the source of the noise and asking if they wanted help. We didn't hear anything else. I yelled at her that we had to go and said that we would make a report just in case, so that we wouldn't be stuck out here. When my friend turned back around and started walking, we heard footsteps behind us. Keep in mind that the person didn't ask for help or call out. When she turned and shone the lights down the tunnel and saw a dark outline of a person walking up, she screeched loudly and it echoed. We ran out and hurried away. Only when we were back at the parking lot and were safely in our cars did we talk about what had happened. She was shaking and crying. She said that she saw the outline of a man running up to us, and she had a sick feeling in her stomach. Something told her that he wanted to hurt us. Worse yet, she wasn't sure, but she said that she saw that he was holding something in his hand. Was it a weapon of some kind? I really don't know, and I don't want to know. Now, there is a chance that she was simply anxious due to all the stories she had heard, and that could have influenced her. I'm not sure if it was a ghost or maybe a person who was down there just waiting for the right time to attack. All I really remember was the frightened scream. Unfortunately, we don't have any photos of what happened because she dropped her camera on the way out. Unless it was stolen, there is a chance that someone at some point could pick it up and see. I went back the day afterward with some of our friends to see if we could find anything. There was no trace of a crime or anything, no blood, and we left empty-handed. We didn't even find the camera. Since we got there as soon as the park was opened, it was unlikely that it was another visitor to the caves. Maybe the person didn't want to have any evidence left about who they were and took it for themselves? I'm not sure. Maybe one of your viewers could tell me what they think might have happened, because I really don't know. My mom thinks it was someone playing a prank on us, and probably thought watching us would be hilarious. Thanks for reading my story, Raven. Cheers. You're one of the best. Well, thank you. On a sun-drenched afternoon at the Gold Coast, Surfer's Paradise, in Brisbane, Australia, I strode along the beach, the salty sea air mingling with the scent of sunscreen. While savoring my ice cream, I watched hot guys with chiseled abs playing beach volleyball out on the sand. It wasn't until I sat down to rest that I realized my sunglasses had broken. Apparently, I had sat on them. So I decided to pop into a nearby sunglasses store to replace them. It was a relief to escape the burning sand on my feet and step into the icy air conditioning of the store. As I walked into the store and began browsing the sunglasses, I noticed something unusual in their reflection. Behind me stood an extraordinarily tall man, about 7 feet high, with skin as white as a piece of paper. His height was striking, making him stand out even more in the store's bright light. At first, I thought that he might be an albino, but then I noticed more details. His fingers were unnaturally long, his ears and nose were tiny, and his eyes were enormous, almost double the size of normal eyes. The next thing I noticed was even stranger. It didn't look like he had teeth at all. Instead, his mouth seemed to have little ridges where teeth would normally be. When he took off the glasses he'd been trying on, I saw his eyes more clearly. Not only were they huge, they weren't the usual green, brown, or blue. Instead, they were a striking reddish pink with a blue ring around them. At that point, I think I may have gasped in shock. With the sound of my gasp, I caught his attention. He turned to look directly at me, his huge eyes locking onto mine. I was frozen, not knowing what to do or where to turn. The intensity of his gaze left me feeling completely paralyzed. When he spoke, the sound that came out was almost like a bird chirping, so delicate and faint that I wasn't sure if it was really him or if he had a baby bird in his pocket. Then I heard a voice in my mind, clear and soothing, saying, "Don't worry, I'm not going to hurt you. I know I look strange, but I'm not here to harm you." At that moment, I was hit with a wave of sensation, like the warm, soothing rush of morphine. It felt like he had some kind of magical power, using it to wrap me in a cocoon of calm. Everything seemed peaceful, as if I were in paradise, and I felt completely at ease, as though nothing could harm me. Was this some kind of drug, or was this something else entirely? As he paid for the sunglasses, I couldn't help shake the feeling of awe and curiosity. The telepathic message and the serene calm he had instilled in me made me question everything. Was this encounter real? Or was I dreaming? The strange sense of calm lingered as I watched him leave, disappearing into the bustling street outside. As he walked away, I felt a surge of curiosity. I decided to follow him, hoping to catch a glimpse of something extraordinary. Maybe a portal like the one I'd heard about at the Miami Mall. But as I reached the street outside, there was nothing unusual to see. Just the waves crashing and the sound of people laughing on the beach. He had vanished without a trace, leaving me with more questions than answers. What did I just witness? Was this simply a tall, albino man? Or was he what they call a tall white, like the ones I've recently researched? I'm beginning to think that maybe not all aliens are as bad as we see in the movies. Perhaps some, like this one, can actually be kind. This encounter made me realize that maybe we should approach the idea of aliens with curiosity, rather than fear. After all, there's a lot we don't understand, and kindness may be more common among them than we think. Hello, Raven. I hope this post finds you and yours well. It's been a while since I've posted a story, and this one really creeped me out, so I hope you enjoy it. My son, 8, told me something that had the heebie-jeebies jiving all over my whole body. As an aside, I'm sorry, but that is an amazing sentence. He recounted a time when he was 4 when he woke up one morning before me and my husband. As kids do, he wandered into our room to wake me up so I could fix him some breakfast. He said as he was approaching the bed to call out to me, and he noticed me and my husband twitching spastically in our sleep. Both of us. Obviously, he was freaking out. So much so that he screamed, which is what woke us up. He told me that even after we bolted up in bed, having been startled by my son's scream, my arm was still noticeably twitching. You know how when you raise yourself up in bed and your elbow is slightly bent? I was in that position, and my arm kept twitching. Apparently, my husband looked at my arm and said, "What the hell?" Now, I have no memory of this at all. I did ask my husband about it, and he confirmed hearing my son scream, and he remembered being woken up out of a dead sleep. He also remembers my arm twitching and his reaction. Something happened later that day that was equally as creepy, and I don't know if it's related, but I'm going to share it anyways if that's okay. So, later that day, I was sitting on the couch playing on my phone. My son goes to the fridge to get a juice box. We lived in a small apartment, and the way it was set up was, when you first walk in, you're in the living room. The living room was connected to the kitchen, and me and my husband's bedroom was just beyond the kitchen. My point being, I had a clear view and was within hearing distance when my son looks over his shoulder towards my dark bedroom and says, "Yeah, I'll be there in a minute." I'm a helicopter mom, no shame, so I always keep an eye on him at any given point. I immediately froze for a second. I promptly called him over and asked him who he was talking to. He looked at me and then back at the bedroom, then back at me with this confused look on his face. He then proceeds to tell me that he heard me holler his name and tell him to come into the bedroom. We were the only ones home. That apartment was definitely haunted or something. Me and my husband have both seen a black hand with long, skinny fingers wrap around our bedroom door frame while sitting on the couch one night. Just a side note for anyone who is curious, we do not live there anymore. My son hears his name being called all the time while he's at his dad's house. I've even heard it. I went over to drop something off one day and his dad asked me if I would stay with our son so he could go to the store. So, Dad leaves, and me and my son are playing in his room when we both heard his dad holler, "Hey," son's name. I said something like, "Oh, I guess your dad didn't leave yet. Let's go see what he needs." We walk out to the front room, and no one is there. We look in the driveway, only my car is there. And no one else lived there at that time either. I know I sort of went off topic a little, but I felt it was relatable because my son hears his name being called all the time. I have some other creepy experiences that happened to me and my son that I will eventually get around to sending in. Thanks for keeping us entertained, Raven. Thank you for allowing me to do so by sending in your story. Hey Raven, this is the first time writing in. I listen to you to fall asleep. I need something to focus on when I go to bed, partially because of reasons I will be divulging in this story. There are several instances I could cite that have to do with this problem that I have. I visited my doctor a few years ago, telling her about these hallucinations I've seen and voices I've heard. However, sometimes I'm not so sure if there isn't something spiritual about them too. My doctor said she didn't really have a safe guess as to what my issues could be. I'm not schizophrenic. They always seem different and they are not consistent, nor do I suffer from any other symptoms of the condition. In this instance, I was around 12 or 13. I lived in a rural area of Indiana for most of my childhood. We had a large modular house, 3 stories tall with several bedrooms and bathrooms, an office, a large living room, and massive yard just over 5 acres, filled with trees and pastures. I'm the youngest of 4, and we have several years between all of us. The next oldest is 5 years older than me. My father worked out of state and would visit on the weekends. It was a pretty disjointed home, and this often meant I was home alone a lot. My mom would come home late from work often because we lived around 40 minutes from her job, and she would sometimes go to the store after. My other siblings were all out of the house except for the next oldest. But she was driving now and worked in town as well, and hung out with friends a lot. Our computers were on the 3rd floor, and I remember playing a lot of Age of Empires and RuneScape at the top of those 3rd floor stairs. I would shut the door though because I hated having the open door to my back. I remember on one of these nights sitting up there playing and my mom yelled up from the 1st floor that she needed help hauling the groceries in. I got off the chair and scurried downstairs to help her, only to find an empty kitchen. I was confused. Did she go into the garage? I opened the door and the garage was empty. Only the faint sound of crickets and frogs came in muted from the walls. I walked back into the kitchen disturbed and a bit confused. I heard her voice. I know that I did. I then saw her headlights pull into the driveway and was both relieved and a little surprised. Did I just predict when Mom would be back? I was happy to not be alone in that house for that moment. I've had several other experiences with both visual and auditory hallucinations that have ranged from amusing, weird, and terrifying. Here's a quick list of what I can remember. My toys moving on the shelf and watching me when I was younger. A giant balloon ghost floating through my yard. Weird, I know. A large wasp in my room. A big black snake coiled on my closet door. People walking past my room. Hearing my name called by my mom's voice a second time. This was in front of my sister and my wife. I responded, "Yeah?" And they all looked at me funny. My mom was in the next room and I thought she called me, but it was soon confirmed that no one was talking at that moment that I thought I heard it. Again, it was so clear that it was like she was in the room and yelled it. Anyways, it feels good to finally share this. Most people are not sure how to react when I tell it, so it's a nice experience to unload a little here and not have the people look at me like I'm crazy or something. And thanks, everyone. This all began for me when I decided to take a solo road trip to Oregon from California. I had never done a solo road trip before, but I figured since I'm 21 and wanted to experience life outside my small town, it would be a great opportunity to explore a little. So I started my journey going up Highway 1 on the coastal road, making good progress and stopping along the way for pictures and making memories for myself. I met some cool people along the way, and was always careful to avoid any suspicious people. Most people were friendly and polite, but as I got to the end of my trip, something odd happened. I was near Bend, Oregon at the Boyad Caves. If you don't know what that is, it's basically a series of cave systems made by prehistoric lava. I decided to check them out because it was only about 30 miles away from the main highway. I got to the caves and noticed one other vehicle parked there. The parking lot was dirt and gravel and very uneven. I noticed this vehicle was parked more tilted because of the uneven terrain. I got out of my car and checked out the other car. It had a replacement tire on and seemed to look abandoned. As I turned my gaze towards where I thought the cave entrance began, I thought to myself, this is kind of scary. I'm in a completely unknown place. Nobody knows I'm here and there's a car parked here, and nobody around. I had also been listening to unexplained encounters the whole trip, so maybe I was overreacting. I got to the cave entrance, which was a hole in the ground and a staircase going down into it. I looked down into the cave, working up the courage to go down. I started making my way down one step at a time and called out, "Hello? Anyone down here?" No reply. I got a few videos and then returned to the surface. I walked back to my car and uploaded it to Instagram, which I felt made myself feel better. Like I was connected to the people who will view it, and if I disappear, someone will know where to look. I went back to the entrance of the cave, and I wanted to get some more videos. I started down the stairs again, and as I'm walking down, there was a woman just standing there on the left of the stairs. I look at her as I'm videoing and ask her if anybody else is here with her. She replies no. I talk to her a little more, trying to not freak out. I ask her where she came from. She said that she had been deeper in the cave and had just walked back up to get some photos. I was freaking out because she had a nice dress on and just her phone. So she had just been wandering around with just her phone flashlight, and nobody down here to make sure she was safe. She could tell that I was freaking out, and she asked me, "Are you scared?" I reluctantly said no, I'm just trying to understand this for myself. We talked for a while in this dark cave in the middle of nowhere, and I eventually got her Instagram. Honestly, this was such a weird thing. I actually got our first interaction where I met her on video. I'm not sure where I could post it, but it was such a weird experience. Regardless of all this, I'm still in contact with her and we might go meet up in the woods. So, more updates coming soon.